a different language. The QR code.
Okay, so if I heard just now that our insert that we had at church this morning takes you to apparently a German language. At least it took Brad to a German language Facebook page. So if that's the case, sorry about that. That is, even though my last name is Frisch, which is German, we're not intentionally bringing it to a German website or a German version of Facebook. Okay. So we're going to continue with Christian theology. This is the second session, and I want to say off the bat that this is the second topic that we're covering. The first topic was just introductory. Tonight, as you can see on the notes, and we put the notes online too on the Facebook page if you'd like to get those, is worldview. We're going to be talking about the worldview that people have, the way that they view the world, and what Christian theology says about that. This will actually probably take a couple of weeks. So hold on to these notes is what I'm saying. And don't get panicky. If we get a half hour or so into this and you're like, we're nowhere close to done, that's why, because I planned for us to take a couple weeks rather than just blow through the material. So I'm going to just show you again what we're actually going to be talking about tonight, and going into next week probably too. So these are the questions we're going to try to answer in this session on worldview. What do people believe in today? Where does the mainstream worldview leave us? Where do we find our answers? Where do we look to for answers? And this is probably going to be more next week. And what does Christianity say about truth? But as we talk about worldview, those are the questions we're going to try to answer. So I have a picture here, because when we talk about worldview, this is about how you see things. So what do you see?
Either a rabbit or a duck.
Yeah. Okay. When you first saw this picture, especially if this is the first time you saw this picture, you probably saw one or the other. Now, if you've seen this before, you probably can see both right away. But the point is, it's really how you look at it, isn't it? And there was actually a picture on Facebook. There's been a few of these pictures on Facebook where it says, what do you see? Like, for example, what is it, a blue dress or a gold dress? Yeah, something like that. So if you're watching on Facebook, what color is my shirt? No, but you know, what color is this dress is the question they're asking. And the picture, to some people, for whatever reason, looks like a blue dress. And other people like a gold. And people have explanations for that. I don't know what the explanation is. Maybe some trick that Facebook is playing on people. But what's funny is we'll get into arguments. People will actually argue about that. They'll be like, no, it's definitely blue. No, it's definitely gold. So when you look at this picture, I think you can tell, if you look at it closely, a lot of people here are saying they see both a rabbit, so these would be the ears, that's the eye, the nose area, or did I hear the other one? Duck, yeah, which that would be the bill of the duck, and that's the eye. It's looking that direction. So worldview is a lot about this. It's how you look at things. And what happens is, the point I want to make about this is we actually take a lot of things for granted. So if you're looking at this and the first thing you saw was a rabbit, if that happened to be what you saw, and you didn't know this was an illusion, you might take that for granted and say, well, of course everybody knows that's a rabbit. Or you might say, that's a duck. Well, of course everybody knows there's a duck. So a good way to illustrate this, another sphere that this comes out is culture. Your cultural background. So what is the correct way to greet someone? What is the correct way to greet someone? All right? Now, it really depends where you're from, doesn't it? Okay? What do you think, Brad? You're like, okay, fist pump. Okay. Now, can you imagine if you go into some cultures and you just put your fist up to them? If they are not from that background, they might consider that a bit threatening. Like, where are you from? What are you doing? All right? Now, what would be another possible way you would greet someone? okay, shake their hands. That actually reminds me on the movie Chronicles of Narnia. I don't know if you ever saw that, when they go into this other world, Narnia, and I think it's Lucy puts her hand out, and the Tumnus character says, "What do I do?" And she says, "Oh, you shake it." So he just takes it, shakes it, and he's like, "Okay." But here's my point. You take these things for granted.
Yeah.
You take it for granted. So for some of us, if we start talking about God, well, of course, God. And you kind of take that for granted. For other people, it's atheism. It's naturalism. Well, of course, we're here by nature. We're here because of natural processes. Of course. It's just taken for granted. And what I want to say in this session is, we have to be careful. We have to take a step back and say, why do we take certain things for granted? Have you ever stopped to think about why you believe or why you look at things the way that you do? That's the purpose of this exercise. So what is it that people believe in? We're actually going to be doing Christian theology in a postmodern world. So I'm using the term postmodern, which is an interesting term. Let me write a few terms up here. The first one is pre-modern. Okay, and then I'll put the term modern, and then I will put the term post-modern. And I'm saying that we are doing theology in a post-modern setting. So you have pre-modern, modern, post-modern. Now, when you see the word modern, we may have differing opinions as to what that means. What would you consider modern? But what this actually has to do with is an outlook on life. So let me illustrate this as we think about the pre-modern outlook, which is actually a certain time period. We could say before the Enlightenment, okay, before, say, the 1700s. We had a pre-modern outlook that a lot of people saw the world through. Then in the 1700s, you had more of a modern outlook, 17 through the 1900s. And then now we're saying that there's more of a postmodern. Postmodern doesn't really describe us, does it? It just says we're past this, whatever this is. So we'll talk about that. But let me illustrate it. This is something that has been said before by other people, but I really like it. If you have an umpire in baseball, what does he do? He calls balls and strikes. That's one of the things he does, right? So if you ask a pre-modern umpire, how do you call balls and strikes? How do you know what to do? He says, I call them as they are. Whatever they are, that's what I call them. If it's a ball, it's a ball. If it's a strike, it's a strike. What does a modern umpire say? He says, I call them as I see them. In other words, what he's saying is I observe. And by observing, I can tell that it is a ball or it is a strike. And then we get to the postmodern umpire. What does he say? They ain't nothing until I call them. What he's saying is that really it has to do with how I look at it. So now I'm just going to delve into that more in the notes here to talk about this. And what I'm saying is we are doing theology where a lot of people look at things from that perspective. And I'm going to try to describe that. But the postmodern viewpoint, let's start with the pre-modern. The pre-modern viewpoint is that the world is dualistic. Now, I don't have this all in the notes because I didn't want it to be overwhelming. But feel free to write what's helpful to you. The pre-modern viewpoint is that the world is dualistic. Okay, so I'll put that up here. Dualistic. And the idea, we're talking about two things, is that there's natural and supernatural, or extranatural. And so there's this idea that there's definitely reality and rationality beyond what you can see. Okay, yeah, there's the world that we see, but there's definitely something beyond that. Pre-modern thought always included that. They had different ways of including it or thinking about it. Some was polytheistic. Some was more, there is a perfect ideal, and everything is a shadow of that perfect ideal. That's what some of the Greek thinkers thought. Monotheistic religion said there's a God behind it all. But the modern viewpoint here is that the world can be known and discovered through human observation. The world can be known and discovered through human observation, through sense experience. And so this leads us into the scientific time period. And Millard Erickson, who I've quoted before, Christian theologian, says basically modernism retained the conception of the world that you see in pre-modern viewpoint, but removed its supernatural or at least extranatural basis. So it's moving toward a closed system rather than a dualistic where there's definitely extranatural, supernatural idea of the world. We're starting to see everything, and we're really interested in the modern time period, how things work, right? Instead of just saying, well, electricity happens because there's some sort of force out there's some sort of maybe supernatural thing happening. Now we want to know, how does nature work? And you have to admit, as we started to learn about electricity, once we learned how not to electrocute ourselves and kill ourselves with it, it's pretty handy, isn't it? We're using it right now, aren't we? In all kinds of ways. Right? How are we using electricity right now? We're streaming on video. We've got a TV up here. How are you seeing me right now? There is some light outside, but we're using electricity. It's pretty handy. And so because of that, we started to say, wow, look at what we can do. Look at what we can do. And so modernism became very characterized by certainty. Certainty. That means there are things we can know. We can discover them. We can observe them and find them out. And there's actually a really good illustration of this in American history. I'm going to show you something that you've seen before, heard before, but pay attention to it from this perspective now. Self-assertion and certainty. We hold these truths, the Declaration of Independence says, to be self-evident. Isn't that interesting? We just know this. How do you know? We just know. It's self-evident. That's really modern thought. Okay? It's that idea that you can just know things. And you may agree with that. Maybe you're thinking, yeah, I absolutely think it's self-evident. Well, that's born out of modern thinking. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their... Now notice this is supposed to be self-evident. And what's included in that? That there's a creator. Is that what postmodernism would say? It's not so self-evident anymore, is it, according to postmodernism? It doesn't have that sense of certainty that we see in modernism. But our founding fathers were willing to write this. It's self-evident. Everyone is created equal, and they have a creator who's given them unalienable rights. Inherent rights that we have. So as time goes on with the modern mindset, you begin to see, instead of the dualistic, integrated thinking that the supernatural and natural go together, you start to see now the certainty in ourselves. And it's separating out the natural from the supernatural. So what we can know and observe is considered based on our reason, and everything else is faith. You've kind of heard this sort of thing, probably. Really good example of it is this guy here. Does anybody know who he is? You don't know who he is? I've talked about him before, but his name is Richard Dawkins, famous atheist scientist. And this is an Oxford, I think they're both Oxford professors, if I remember correctly, but this is John Lennox, a famous Christian mathematician. and they've done debates. So, if you ever just want to have your mind stretched and just listen to these guys. But what's so interesting is Dawkins has said, and in a debate he said, what you can't understand by reason and evidence that's what people use faith for. He's very derogatory toward faith. It doesn't have evidence, so you just have faith. And John Lennox said to him, well, do you have faith in your wife? And Dawkins said, yes, I do. And then he realized, wait a second, wait. He caught himself a little bit, and Lennox is saying, well, is her love a reality? How do you know? Is it observed? Well, so he's a modern thinker, though. Very modern in his approach, separating reason from faith, and saying we can only know what we can observe through science. Now, I'm going to talk about this, that we're doing theology today, and everything we live in today is more postmodern. And so postmodernism is really the soil of our present-day ideologies and the mood of our culture. And I think the best way to show you how this kind of happens is to just show you kind of the cynicism. Before we had so much certainty, but we're going to go from certainty to cynicism. Except I've got to spell it right here. I'll do my best. Schism, I think is right. Did I get that right? Well, whether I did or not, that's what we're going to go with today. Cynicism, I think that's right. So cynicism, doubt. And a good example of this is, what do they say? What did science tell us about what we should eat? All right? We're supposed to be so certain, right? We know, we can discover things if we do enough observing and studying. Well, let me ask you. Can you answer this question?
Yes.
It depends on the week.
Yes.
Okay, I'm getting thumbs up. I didn't ask you how you feel. I want to know. Are eggs good for me?
Yes.
All right.
Not if you have high cholesterol.
All you modern thinkers who are so certain about this. What I'm trying to say is science has actually told us both. It's actually told us both. Sometimes it looks at the evidence and says, no, it's not so good for you. Sometimes it looks at the evidence and says, yes, it is. But the problem is it's so certain, right? And we've been disillusioned by this. We've been disappointed and sometimes annoyed to death by this. We start eating something because they're like, it's good for you. And then all of a sudden, someday down the road, they go, no, it's not. What are you doing? Or the opposite. I stopped eating that for the last 5 years and now you're telling me it's good? So postmodernism, that viewpoint, highlights a lack of certainty and focuses on perspective. I'm going to write that word. Perspective. Postmodern viewpoint highlights that the understanding we have of the world is relative to each person. And what it is trying to get at, what it tends to say, is that we each have to find our own meaning in our own personal truth. Now, depending on your background, that either rubs you the wrong way, or you're like, that's spot on. But postmodern thinking would say, we each have to find our own meaning in personal truth. So if you're listening to this and you're saying, I'm not sure about that, I'm just telling you, this is the culture. You can go out there and talk to people, and you probably have, talking to people, and you'll hear them say something like this. This is my personal truth. It gives me meaning. Well, that's just the things we take for granted in our culture, the viewpoint that we tend to have. Now, what I'm saying, because I brought up the egg illustration, is everything we think grows out of this mood, and it's actually the result of the weaknesses of modern Western approach to discovering truth. The egg illustration shows you that it's not always easy to figure things out, even though modernism produced the concept of people like Sherlock Holmes, who could just look at you and say, I looked at your clothes, I know exactly who you are, where you've been, what you do for a living. That's really modernism on full display, right? There's some truth to that. Like, you can really discover a lot if you're very observant. But why is Sherlock Holmes always right? Always. Why? Do you know why he's always right?
Genius.
He's a genius. He's always right because it's fiction. And the author made it up, you know. But it does speak to something that resonated with modern thinking. But I think now we say, wait a second, how much can you really discover just based on human observation? Now, even with the Bible, modern thinking said, you know what, we'll go back to the Bible and we will look at everything with our Sherlock Holmes lenses. This happened a lot in the 1800s. It was called higher criticism. And they would look at the Bible and they would try to do a Sherlock Holmes things. And they actually had theories about the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, written traditionally, known to be written by Moses or compiled by Moses, right? And they said, no, we can read this. And we do our investigation, and we think 4 different people wrote it in 4 different time periods. And you're thinking, how did you get that? Well, we look at the word usage and all this stuff, and we can just figure this out. They're doing the Sherlock Holmes thing, right? And so they would say these books were written long after the time of Moses. It's really cool, though. You know what we've done since time has gone on, and this is because we believe in discovery. We continue to dig up ancient artifacts and ancient fragments of things in the past. We have a fragment of the book of John. Realize this is a copy from Egypt, from the mid-100s. This fragment here, now granted it's small, but when I say the 100s, do you understand what time period that's from? Jesus lived in the 1st century, right? So around, he was crucified around the year 30. And so, yeah, the disciples, they wrote these books, but when criticism, the rational criticism came along and said, well, these books in the Bible written long after, what our fragments are showing us is that these books were not only written very early, but they were distributed. This was found in Egypt. Okay? And we just happened to find that fragment. So the obvious assumption then is that there are earlier copies that are closer to the time and to the location of where Jesus was. So we just keep digging up stuff and we find that, okay, rationalism sometimes is not as perfect as Sherlock Holmes. So there are weaknesses in modernism. And one of the weaknesses of modernism, it's a huge weakness, has to do with this question. Is having knowledge in and of itself going to produce good results? Is having knowledge, if we just acquire more and more knowledge as humans, will that automatically spell out progress? The modern assumption is yes, right? So certain. Yes. We just discover more, know more, have science, and everything will be happy. We'll all live in harmony and peace. So one writer, Diogenes Allen, said that part of the collapse of modern thinking is the failure of the modern world to find a basis for morality and society. And this is actually Millard Erickson, who I referenced earlier, quoting, where he's summarizing. The goal was to establish a rational ethic. In other words, we're going to discover what's right and wrong just using our rational thinking. And to demonstrate by reason alone the universal morality and basis for society, we will all agree on what is right. But this modernity has failed to do. The failure was not so evident as long as the members of society basically adhered to traditional values based on Greek and Christian principles. But with the abandonment of such values, however, a virtual chaos has resulted, similar to the time of the Old Testament judges, when everyone did what was right in his or her own sight. That's the way the Bible puts it. They each did what was right in his own sight. But what does it also bring about? When we say humans alone can determine what is good if they just acquire enough knowledge, you know what we get? We get the 1900s. What an awesome time, right? I mean, just with our scientific advancement, we could just produce such great things, couldn't we? It was horrific. It was horrific. I mean, of course, we tend to focus on this one, but the atheistic, communistic regimes killed even more people than the Nazis. Now, we're not saying that atheists are all, bad. That's not at all what we're saying. But what we're saying is, just because you have knowledge doesn't mean you're going to use it in a good way. So modernism does not necessarily produce good results and correct conclusions. I hope we'll learn that lesson. And I think we came to a realization, but what it left us with is, again, this is nothing. It's just saying we're past this. We don't know where we are. We just know, okay, there's a problem here. But that chaos I just read about, that's why I believe so strongly that Christian theology speaks to today. What the Bible says speaks to today. What Jesus says speaks to today. Because where does this worldview that we have today leave us? And I have a few things here on your notes. Number one, our culture is disintegrating. If something's integrated, it all fits together. If it's disintegrated, it begins to break apart. I'm saying our culture, now these are just my observations, is disintegrating. Have you noticed that? Are people more and more in agreement and together and at peace with one another? We can't even decide what's right. We agree less and less, and there's greater and greater, tell me if you've heard this word a little bit lately, anxiety. I mean, as Americans, we have all this science, we have all this stuff, but we are the most anxious, aren't we? And hopeless. Think of the suicide rates. It's a disintegrating culture. It's also a culture, again, these are my observations. We could probably fill in the blank. You could fill in the blank with a lot of words. But here's another one I've noticed lately. Angry. A little bit of anger out there. But a lot of it's our own choices. We've abandoned the Judeo-Christian ethic of what relationships ought to be and what marriage ought to be, for example. And good marriages, I think we see this in our culture, are becoming rarer and rarer. And there's a brokenness in the family. But there's a lot of anger in this culture. We're blaming a lot. So I think there's a couple of questions that this leaves us with. Well, what is truth? Well, where are we going to find our answers? It's a tough question. Where do we find truth? It's a tough question for our culture. And again, if you're from a Christian standpoint, it's easy to maybe take this for granted, but we don't want to. So it's an important question. But I want to show you something in the Bible. This is a passage in John chapter 20 where Jesus is on trial before the Roman official Pilate. And the Roman official says, "You are a king then?" Pilate asked. "You say that I'm a king," Jesus replied. "I was born for this, and I've come into the world for this, to testify to the truth." I'm here to tell people the truth. "Everyone who's of the truth listens to my voice," Jesus says. What does Pilate say in response? What is truth? What is truth? It's a question a lot of people are asking today. It's not a new question. So where do we find it? Now, I'm really just going to hint at what we're going to talk about more next week. I'm going to leave us hanging. But you do see in your notes there 4 things that Ravi Zacharias says a worldview needs to answer. I will give this to you tonight, but we'll explain it more next time. We need to answer about our origin, about our meaning, about our morality, what's right and wrong, and then our destiny. What is the purpose for which we're headed? Where are we going? And to answer these questions, he points out that there are 2 things that you need to do. Your answers need to correspond with evidence, the truth. Like you can't just make up something that doesn't exist in reality. It has to correspond to truth. And it also needs to fit together. You can't say, well, we're here by accident, but we have a purpose. It's got to all fit together. And I'll also give you this preview, that there are 3 worldviews, basically. I mean, you can break this down a lot more, but basically, three ways of looking at things. Only the universe exists. That's naturalism. Only God exists. Okay, there are actually beliefs out there that say everything is God. And 3, both God and the universe exist, which is theism. And I think if you understand Christian theology, you'll know where we're going with this. But we're going to talk about those things next week. So we're going to discover truth, and we're going to look more at what Jesus says and what the Bible says. But these are the things that have to be answered. And my question for everyone is, do you sense the hopelessness of our culture? Do you sense that there's a need for answers? And what are the answers we give to these questions? This is why I think it's so important we continue our discovery of what Jesus says and what Christian theology says. Let's pray. Father, my prayer is, first of all, thank you so much that we can do this, that we can live in a place like this country where we have the freedom to discuss these things. But Lord, we realize the world has changed so much. And for those who are Christians, it can be overwhelming. So I pray that you'll help us to face this hour with confidence and with trust in you. But for those who are not Christians, Lord, I believe that there's a sense of despair. And I pray, Lord, that what we talk about and that who we are in our lives might bring hope to other people. That you might use us, Lord, to share with other people the greatness of who Jesus is. And I pray that our series and what we talk about here would help us with that. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we will now